Our next segment for today, we have Singapore Sustainable Finance Association, who will discuss how industry initiatives can support credible corporate transitions and complement whole of Singapore government efforts in transitioning to a low-carbon economy. There will be a presentation followed by a panel discussion. We may need to wait for about a few more minutes as we wait for the last panelist to arrive. So, do you want to go ahead first? Okay, we will push ahead while we wait for the last panelist to arrive. So it is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Kavitha, Director of Singapore Sustainable Finance Association, to kick off this session. Kavitha, please. Mike or handheld?
Thanks, Felix. It's good afternoon, first of all, and it's lovely to see you all. And thank you for joining the session, which is hosted by Singapore Sustainable Finance Association. So maybe to kick off, who are we? So we are a cross-sectoral industry body. We've been set up by Monetary Authority of Singapore, along with the financial sector. And the mandate for us is to really support and develop the ecosystem for sustainable finance in Singapore. So what we serve is a key platform for public and private engagement that engages on topics that are of strategic importance to Singapore. And this includes carbon markets, transition finance, blended finance, natural capital and biodiversity, as well as taxonomy. So today, SSFA brings together more than 118 organizations across capital providers, industry actors, as well as ecosystem enablers, who are all working towards advancing solutions that can accelerate Asia's transition. Our carbon markets work in particular is actually led by Climate Impact X and Standard Chartered, and is very strongly supported by subgroup leads from GenZero as well as South Pole, and with PwC team serving as our knowledge partner. So we've identified 3 priority drivers that we believe are essential to scaling the carbon market in Asia. Starting with interoperable carbon markets. So SSFA has signed a memorandum of collaboration with carbon market associations in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand to develop an ASEAN common carbon framework. And this effort really aims to support a more harmonized as well as interoperable regional carbon market in ASEAN. Second is really financing. So we're working to develop financial frameworks as well as innovative financial solutions that can mobilize bank and debt capital for high-quality carbon projects and enable this market to scale further. And finally, demand and corporate use. So SSFA is developing a claims guidance document, which is complementary to the voluntary carbon market guidance that's been put out by the Singapore government. And what this is meant to do is really provide that practical step-to-step guide for corporates on the appropriate use of carbon credits. So our work on the claims guidance has been an industry-wide effort over the last year. It's been led by South Pole, with PwC coming in as a knowledge partner. So today we will share both the development process of this work as well as some of the key insights that has emerged from this work so far. So to deliver this presentation, I would like to invite to the stage Ms. Eu-Lin Fang, Sustainability and Climate Change Leader at PwC Singapore, as well as Mr. Shawn Wang, who is a Senior Manager at PwC Singapore. Thank you, everyone. Eu-Lin, the floor is yours.
Well, so thanks very much, everybody, for attending this session. My name is Eu-Lin, and thanks, Kavitha, for that very, very good sharing just now. So on behalf of the working group of the claims guidance document, my colleague Shawn and I are pleased to introduce our work and status of this initiative, where we will highlight the problem statement, the intent of the claims guidance document, our progress to date and plans, including the building blocks that we are developing as a practical guidance for the use of carbon credits when making claims. Yep. So, an important part of the process has been leveraging relevant and quality guidance documents such as the VCMI Claims Code of Practice. But just wanted to give a little bit of background. While it actually has been already 10 years since the Paris Agreement and 5 years to the 2030 mark, however, we still face an implementation gap of 24 to 27 gigatons, which is really the difference between what our policies are right now and what is actually needed. While the climate financing gap is closing, actually in 2023 we had about 1.9 trillion already allocated. It is not close enough. And we need really about 4.4 trillion, which is required each year to meet the lowest needs scenario. So, well-functioning carbon credit markets through emission reduction and removal projects can actually help with the emissions gap and also the financing gap as well. It is actually also very vital that the principles of a credible decarbonisation plans by corporates are also upheld too. Just at the bottom there are just 3 points. So we were also wondering, why is it that the carbon markets are not scaling up as much as we want it to be? And we came up with these top 3 points. There's a survey that was conducted. My colleague Shawn will go into that a little bit later. Firstly, there is a lack of clear understanding on the role of carbon credits and the associated claims. Secondly, there's a lack of understanding of the how to use carbon credits in its decarbonisation strategy and associated claims that corporates can make. And thirdly, but not least, very important, is the potential reputational risk that is linked with the use of carbon credits that we really need to look out for. So recently on the 28th of October 2025, about 2 weeks ago, the National Climate Change Secretariat, including the Ministry of Trade and Industry and also Enterprise Singapore, issued the guidance on the role of carbon credits in corporate decarbonisation, a very succinct document that laid out the key points and principles to address the first and also the third challenge. This includes highlighting the needs for companies to first implement the initiatives set out in their decarbonisation plans, prioritising all feasible reductions and removals before considering the use of high-quality carbon credits to address their remaining emissions. This includes the reiteration that carbon credits need to be credible and effective and must be of high integrity, which are the principles of no double counting, additionality, quantifiability, verifiability, permanent, legal, no leakage, and do no net harm. So just to share, the claims guidance document that we want to produce, are already introducing and started our work knee-deep already, responds to the second point. And it goes to show how to best use carbon credits, including further granularity and detailed guidance on implementation, segmentation of the portfolio of companies, quality of carbon credits and other considerations, key elements of a credible decarbonisation plan and use cases as well. The target audience is first the corporates in Singapore, but multinational corporates can also use this for their operations in Singapore, but apply discretion if they want to use it for more global purposes outside of Singapore. The sector guidance will first be sector agnostic, but will consider also the unique challenges, particularly for hard-to-abate sectors, to meet their near-term targets. Just to share a little bit of background, Kavitha just now shared, that it's actually quite a large working group. Actually, it is. And to obtain relevant and also comprehensive set of views, we had quite a number as well of participants in this working group that was assembled as the core working group. These comprise of people from backgrounds of financial institutions, exchanges, project investors, corporates, rating agencies, lawyers, consultants such as ourselves. And the names and companies which are highlighted in light blue are actually our co-leads, which we got a lot of leadership from, so we're very thankful for them. So just to share more briefly, our work actually started in Q4 last year, and the whole process as we started off was scoping the problem. And we really want to actually try to issue out the claims guidance no later than June 2026. So we have another 6 months as well. During the intervening period, we've been conducting quite a number of surveys to get input about what would be useful in terms of having a claims guidance document that will allow corporates to actually move forward with more confidence. To that, I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Shawn, who's going to deep dive a little bit more into the foundational blocks of what the claims guidance will look like. Over to you, Shawn.
Thanks, Eu-Lin, and a very good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to the session. In the next few minutes, I'm going to talk through some of the key highlights during the process of the development of the claims guidance. For phase one, as Eu-Lin mentioned, we have a our primary objective is actually to look at what are the existing work have been done already, and also what are the key, so how do we actually leverage them effectively as well. So by doing this, and in order for us to do so, we have actually tried to identify what are the key consensus around all the work has already been done, but at the same time also understand what are the key divergences as well. Overall, we have reviewed about 12 key documents, which are showing on the screen on the right. And among them, we have identified the 7 key documents, which we think it's actually quite important for the development of Singapore claims guidance. This document includes the established global documents such as SBTI, VCMI, and ISO. The research we have done actually was conducted against the 4 key research areas and also the 14 evaluation criteria, which are listed there. So throughout our research, we have observed some consensus. The things around the necessity of having a well-defined climate roadmap, but at the same time also things around the sort of no requirements around geographical restrictions for the carbon projects where it locates. So those are the things which are pretty common sort of, which are the consensus which across the different documents. But at the same time, we have also found that there are a few sort of key differences as well. So the key task for us is actually really to understand for those key differences, what are the suitable practice for the Singapore corporates to take on. And for example, for the project type restrictions, what we have aligned is actually we shouldn't be too restrictive around what type of carbon projects that the company should be focusing on in terms of reduction and removal, at least in the near term, as long as the quality is there. And for those points, there are still quite a few divergences, which we think it takes a while for us to land on what are the options for Singapore to take on. And those are the things we have included in as the next section for our, to gather further insights from our survey and the focus group discussions. So as Eu-Lin mentioned earlier, in the phase 2, we have conducted a survey to about 16, we have received about 16 responses from the large corporates in Singapore, including real estate companies and also a lot of financial institutions. The data we have received on the carbon accounting was quite expected, I would say. Most of the companies in Singapore has already set the emission targets against Scope 1 and 2 and also have done their reporting accordingly as well. But for Scope 3, it's a little bit different. I think we see less companies have reported the Scope 3 emissions, and also only half of them have set the targets against the Scope 3 emissions as well. And that has reflected the current market maturity, I believe, across the different scopes of the emission reporting and the target setting. So turning on to the engagement on the voluntary carbon markets, the results were actually quite promising. We find about 60% of the companies in Singapore has already purchased carbon credits or intended to purchase carbon credits. We also have investigated about the primary objective about why they are actually wanting to buy carbon credits in the voluntary carbon markets. I think emission offsetting stay on the top, and then followed by some of the other incentives, such as the demonstrating the leadership, environmental leadership, and fulfilling the stakeholders' expectations. Earlier in the presentation, I think Eu-Lin has mentioned about the barriers that corporate has faced in using carbon credits in the voluntary carbon markets. I think the claims guidance is for us to really provide that clearer guidance around how corporates can actually do the step-by-step implementation of usage of the voluntary carbon credits. We also surveyed the respondents around the top 3 desired factors that the corporates would like to see in the claims guidance as well. And those 3 key factors, I think the top one is really around the industry standards recognition. I know some of the VCMI and perhaps SBTI people are in the room as well. I think that sort of recognition is also quite important for the corporate in Singapore as well, to make this claims guidance useful in enhancing the demand side of the carbon markets. And then the second sort of factor we look at is really around I think the stakeholders and the clients' expectation as well. I think that's also pretty critical for the corporates as well. And the third one is a bit of a split. I think recognizing by the government, I think some of the corporates actually are expecting this to be mandated, but some of them actually see the value of just the voluntary recognition and endorsement as well. So I think we see a bit of a split view around when it comes to the government endorsement for the claim guidance. And for this one, because there's a bit of a divergence, I think we'll also try to explore that in the further sort of discussions in the focus group discussion. But at the same time, I think this is also quite critical for us to inform the key building blocks for the claims guidance development as well. So I have shown about 6 key building blocks on the screen. So what I will do is just dive into maybe a few of them. I think the first one, I will just start with the segmentation and also baseline ambition. Yeah. I think at the outside of our development, I think we all understand, we all actually want to aspire to get all companies in Singapore, regardless of size, to actually adopt the carbon credits. And this is one of our foundation about how we should be actually developing our claims guidance. And that's also why the whole segmentation is so important. We have actually, to ensure that inclusivity of all companies in kind of participating in the voluntary carbon markets. So in developing the segmentation principles, we have established a few areas. Firstly, we believe the large companies should actually still maintain the high ambition levels. But at the same time, I think we have actually listened to the corporates who actually participated in the survey as well, and who told us that some practical requirements for the medium and the small companies are also important for them to enhance the adoption and immediate actions on the decarbonization actions and efforts. And lastly, we want to keep the segmentation quite simple, that corporates is easy to understand and adopted as well. On the baseline ambition, we have also introduced a few preconditions as well. And those preconditions is help us to further enhance and bolster the credibility of the usage of the voluntary carbon credits. For example, the companies are required to adhere to the decarbonization mitigation hierarchy. But at the same time, they should ensure that they have a proper inventory against scope 1 and 2, and also set the target accordingly as well. And that's particularly sort of relevant for at least the large and the medium-sized company as well. And quality is also another very essential building blocks for the adoption of the voluntary carbon credits. And that's why we also sort of aligned very closely with Singapore government around some of the position and the principles that companies should be adopting in ensuring the quality of carbon credits. And I think when the companies start to consider purchasing of high quality carbon credits, they need to make sure that those credits are adhere to the principles around ICVCM core carbon principles, but at the same time also the Singapore ICC, the International Carbon Credits Framework as well. And in addition to consider the quality, we believe that companies should are encouraged to consider beyond that as well. I think things around co-benefits, as well as those purchasing the carbon credits where vintage is actually within their commitment period, are highly encouraged as well to ensure that beyond the quality, they're also considering other things as well to offer additional benefits to the society and environment. So with those building blocks, I think the guidance aims to provide a very comprehensive framework which guide effective carbon credits usage, reinforce the credibility, and facilitate the impacts for decarbonization strategies across corporates in Singapore. So with that, I'll hand over back to Eu-Lin to close it out.
Thanks very much, Shawn, for deep diving a little bit more into what we're going to be exploring for some of the aspects of the key building blocks for the claims guidance. Well, we discussed just now that we are going to be really leveraging on what are good guidance which is out there, but going a little bit deeper. One of them, as we mentioned, was the one that the Singapore government had come out with a couple of weeks ago. But just last week as well, there was the SHAP principles aimed at fostering high integrity use of carbon credits, which was a combination of 5 countries from the UK to Panama as well. And whilst we're going to be building the claims guidance closely with that, one of the areas that the SSFA is also trying to do, and one of the main goals is really to engage in strategic discussions to broaden the scope of these efforts through the ASEAN region. The goal is to really craft a unified ASEAN common carbon framework claims guidance, mirroring the process that we've also followed. So in doing our part, we hope that this document that eventually will be published by mid of next year will be a useful step towards greater implementation of a well-functioning and vibrant carbon market. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And now, maybe look forward to the panel discussions where we'll deep dive more into this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eu-Lin and Shawn, for setting the context for this discussion. Really appreciate it. So we will now move to the panel discussion. And to get things started, let me invite our esteemed panelists to the stage in alphabetical order, starting with Mr. Anshari Rahman, Director of Policy and Analytics, GenZero. Mr. Benedict Chia, Director General, Climate Change, National Climate Change Secretariat, Strategy Group, Prime Minister's Office. Mr. Christopher Leeds, Head, Carbon Markets Development, Standard Chartered. And Mr. Saurabh Joshi, Head of Origination and Strategic Partnership, Climate Impact X. First of all, thank you for joining us today. I think MAS, with your traction work and the cracker of the panel that we had this morning, has set the stage for like a full-on discussion on carbon credits. But what we had with traction was that one use case of carbon credits, and here we're going to go broader than that. And I want to kind of like frame this in three parts. I want to start with broader corporate decarbonization and where we are, and then kind of bring in carbon credits and how that supports corporate decarbonization and in fact, like, maybe like even accelerate it. And finally, we will unpack like, what are the other enablers apart from everything that's happening in the ecosystem that's needed to really scale this market. So to get things started, I mean, Saurabh, you kind of bring in that perspective of exchange, and you are engaging with corporates on their journey to procuring carbon credits. So if I ask you to take a step back, how are corporates in Asia approaching transition? So we have enough of frameworks which are in the market. Where are these being currently used? And what are some of these stumbling blocks, which is stopping them from getting over the line?
Thanks. Thanks, Kavitha, and thanks for the opportunity to be here on the panel today. I think when you look at Asia, and Southeast Asia in particular, what is striking is just how uneven the playing field is when it comes to the different sort of transition planning that goes on behind for different corporates. I think on the one hand, you have large listed companies, regional multinationals, especially those that are interacting with international capital, that are actually taking active steps to align with well-recognized frameworks. They're setting climate disclosures in accordance with ISSB. Some are setting science-based targets to assure their investors that all their growth ambitions are grounded in sustainable pathways. And it's moving beyond just target setting to actually incorporating it into the actual procurement. They're asking suppliers for details on emissions data. They are looking at exchanges like CIX to understand how they could potentially engage in carbon markets. And so we see a lot of activity amongst that segment of corporates. At the same time, I think you have a very large group of small and medium enterprises, a large group of family-owned businesses across Southeast Asia. And there the story is a little bit different. I think it's all very new still to many of them. There is the intent. I think they do want to participate in the market. They do want to sort of take action, but the questions are still very much, how do we do this? What am I supposed to do? What sort of frameworks or help can I potentially access that can get me started? And that's where I think a lot of the policy work that SSFA is doing, that the government is doing, also comes into play. Speaking about policy, I think on the Singapore side, we've seen the kind of requirement for corporates, listed corporates to release their climate disclosures. It's, I think, soon going to extend to large non-listed corporates as well. We're seeing similar kind of waves in Malaysia. I think Indonesia, Thailand has also different degrees of requirements around sustainability reporting. So as a region, I think there's a lot that's happening to try and encourage all the corporates, whether you're large or small, to move along the value chain and start kind of accounting for transition planning. Fair to say that right now a lot of the focus is still probably around the large listed multinationals, but I'm pretty sure we'll get there with the broader group of companies soon enough.
Thanks, Saurabh. And it sort of like hones in on the point that Shawn mentioned about that market segmentation and you would need different targeted initiatives for that. One of the questions when you talk about corporate decarbonization, typically the first question is, how do you sort of know it's credible? And I want to sort of put that question to the lender and the investor on the panel, Chris and Anshari. How do you sort of deduce what is a credible corporate transition plan, and how you as a lender in what is the role that like you play as an investor, you play to sort of shape it? Chris, do you want to go first?
Well, actually, as a bank within our own, net zero plans, we don't recognise carbon credits, and that's because that follows it's initially SBTI and GFAN's and NZBA's guidance, and I think that's been problematic. Because that, if we did, that would actually create a very strong business case. If we were able to actually tell companies that you can decarbonize, but also there are ways of actually being able to accelerate that decarbonisation and to certainly accelerate global decarbonisation. When you've got companies that are off track, then carbon credits can be actually quite useful in that scenario. But I think that's one of the reasons why this is so important. So putting my other hat on for the moment, which is as a board member of the ICVCM, the Integrity Council. When we first started working on scaling, and that all goes all the way back to the task force for scaling the voluntary carbon markets, which is where the ICVCM essentially came from, I think one of the mistakes that we made was that we didn't really focus enough on demand. It was very much driven by project developers, the standard setters and such like, and we didn't really ask demand what it is that they wanted. And I think this rectifies that. This enables us to understand what it is that buyers really want. And in many cases, buyers don't know what they want. They think they know what they want, and they think that they're looking for guidance from other entities, governments to some extent, but also just well-respected organisations. And obviously, that's what the SSFA aims to do. And of course, I'm part of that organisation too. So giving that, taking what they want and what they need to do around decarbonisation and what the limitations are of the mitigation hierarchy. This idea that yes, we should all reduce our emissions as quickly as possible. We all agree with that. But actually, if it was that easy, we would be all on track and we would be heading towards net zero. And we know we're not. We're nowhere near that, right? And so that's why I think carbon credits and carbon markets can help accelerate things. It's about getting money into projects and difficult areas of investment and locations where it wouldn't get it otherwise, but also actually helping companies to get themselves back on track and get the global net zero back on track. That's the key.
So building on that, like sort of that mitigation hierarchy and whether corporates have gone through that, all possible abatement measures, like how do you sort of assess that?
Well, I mean, right now there are different frameworks, right, to define what is credible decarbonization. It'd be quite interesting to actually go deeper into SBTI's latest version and actually do a compare and contrast with its first version. I would point out two things. One is really how SBTI is starting to look at carbon pricing, right? You've essentially got now two tiers, recognized group of companies that are doing something to abate, but the leadership component, which is quite interesting, the group of companies that are actually introducing an internal carbon price of $80 per ton, right? And this is actually one of the indicators that investors are also looking at, right? It's going beyond trust me to show me, right? How are you planning for a future where you're exposed to higher carbon price and how you're planning for that transition? And how SBTI is now starting to look at carbon credits. And may I go further to say, beyond carbon credits, other environmental certificates, right? So it's an interesting space to look at, right? Because right now you're starting to see the space start to converge around recognizing the realities of abating hard to abate sectors, or how do you define residual emissions, and how could companies actually do more? And this could be through the use of carbon credits. And this is where the claims guidance from the Singapore government and the work that SSFA will do in terms of putting flesh to the bone is very important, right? Because it provides clarity. We know it's a very fragmented, it's a very confusing market. What is a reductions credit? What is the removal credits? Technology nature, which is better? What are the risks? So hold it at the top. All right. Okay. So I think this claims guidance is actually a good first step to provide that confidence for corporates in terms of planning their decarbonization journey, right? The two things to address in the broader carbon space: how do you avoid greenwashing, right? But then how do you also prevent companies from green hashing? It's a very dangerous alternative out there because inaction is worse than doing something, right? Yeah.
So, not trust me, but show me. I like that. Like, and that kind of takes me to the government sector.
Show me the money. We need more demand in carbon credit.
So Benedict, like Singapore has obviously put out like one of the first few countries to put out the 2035 NDCs. And in terms of, as you're planning, like, you know, Singapore's climate and economic strategies, like corporate decarbonization is a big part of it. So how are you sort of like attributing that, and where are you like expecting like, you know, this to sort of like go in the next 4 to 5 years?
You've got to eat it.
Hi. Okay. That's a special way of holding the mic itself. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. We're one of the first few countries, and I think that's a very good starting point because corporate decarbonization is going to be key for national governments to be able to meet their goals itself. And the first starting point is always what is the overall goal itself, and having a clear pathway towards net zero by 2050, at least for Singapore, is critical. And that's why we're one of the first few countries to actually lean forward and to put forth our pledge. It's a range, and the more ambitious end of the range actually translates to a linear trajectory down all the way towards net zero itself. And that's really meant to provide clarity and certainty in terms of the milestones that we should be working towards. So that's the first layer, setting clear targets with clear interim milestones. The next layer is what exactly are our key strategies in order to reach those goals. And we have laid it out in all our climate change plans, all the key needle moving measures, what are the various things that we are doing in various sectors. And the whole idea of putting all this out is that when corporates are thinking about their decarbonization, they have a clear idea of where the country is going as a whole and what it intends to prioritize in various sectors itself, which are the levers in which it thinks it's most critical in terms of actually making a difference. And I'd say underpinning all that are what I call key enablers. And the two that come very clearly to mind, especially in the context of this discussion, is firstly, a meaningful carbon price, which we have also laid out, a certain trajectory. There's a certain range because there's a lot of uncertainty and we want to have the flexibility to pivot as and when necessary itself. But the other aspect of it is really to tap on carbon markets. And we have given corporates the flexibility to use carbon credits, Article 6 credits, to meet part of their carbon tax compliance itself. And not just only the key levers, but we are also working with key groups out there, including the work with SSFA in terms of helping corporates put together a decarbonization plan. And the whole idea is to have a framework that actually allows them to cite and to better understand the context in which these decarbonization plans should be developed. Thanks.
Thanks, Benedict. And really clear, like in terms of laying out that sector transition pathways, right? How do each like of the critical sectors really get there? Sort of want to move into the next session where, like, you know, we look at that intersection with carbon markets a little bit more closely and unpack that like a lot more. And especially with the number of guidances and like work that's happened in this space to kind of like, you know, look at it as to what this all adds up to. So maybe Saurabh, again, like your sort of vantage point of like that exchange, and where are your conversations today with corporates in terms of like carbon credits usage and the slew of initiatives that sort of come out like in Singapore? Do you see it incrementally giving them more confidence, at least to start looking at this market more actively?
Absolutely. I mean, I think initially there are probably 3 areas which most companies are lacking in, or which is inhibiting them from participating more actively in the market, right? One is just around their own governance, corporate governance. Not enough boards in Southeast Asia actually, you know, start looking at decarbonization. And until decarbonization becomes part of their oversight and part of capital allocation within that corporate, it's very difficult for them to get the ball rolling, even if they want to go down the path of participating in the carbon market. Second is probably, I mean, it's linked to disclosures, but maybe a step back. I think the corporates need to understand what they need to account for. Scope 3 continues to be a major problem, regardless of whether it's in Asia or anywhere in the world, when it comes to actually having good quality, high integrity data. And I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on that front to have, credible data to be able to build credible targets and then participate credibly in the carbon market. And the last is really around financing. I think everyone recognizes that we do need to allocate financing to climate action and projects that can help achieve it. But within the Southeast Asian region, I think many corporates still struggle to actually access some of that capital at affordable or rates, and maybe Chris can speak to that. But I think that's another area which probably needs a little more development and kind of innovation within the space in Asia to really start seeing more activity from corporates in carbon markets.
So what I'm hearing is there is still work that needs to be done at that decarbonization level to sort of get the confidence that corporates have done their bit before, they can embark on that, carbon credits. And so in that, clearly Singapore government has been pretty forward-leaning in putting out that, clear guidance for voluntary market. A good amount of work that was done, initially was on the compliance side. But, what was the thinking, for, Singapore government to do this? And how do you kind of see this, the voluntary claims guidance, actually building that legitimacy for carbon credits?
Yeah. So, actually, the impetus for us to put forth domestic guidance is really in response to clear feedback that we have been hearing from our stakeholders, especially those within ecosystem, those within industry. They wanted guidance from government. They wanted governments to step in because so far, before we came in, it was very much left to the private sector to decide how exactly credit should be used itself. So this was in response. When we put together our guidance, it was really through an extensive period of feedback and engagements which we had with various companies in terms of what are some of the key elements that they hope to see itself. And I'd say there are a few parts to this. One is, under what circumstances can corporates use carbon credits? We have spoken a lot about a mitigation hierarchy. We have spoken a lot about prioritizing internal action as and when it actually makes sense. But one of the key gaps is, how do you actually determine that itself? And we have laid out in our guidance various possibilities in which company can or corporate can decide or identify what's feasible and not what's feasible. So doing things like looking at potential studies, undertaking such in-depth assessment, looking at benchmarking studies, referencing some of the best practices. So it's a fairly exhaustive list, but we were also quite deliberate in terms of not wanting to be too prescriptive, for the simple reason that corporates in different sectors, in different geographies, especially Singapore-based companies that have operations around the world, actually face different sort of constraints. And really the onus is on the corporates to make use of the suite of tools available to identify the best pathway forward and to communicate those in a very transparent manner itself. So that's one piece. Under what circumstance you can actually use carbon credits. The other important pillar is what sort of credits can you actually use? Everybody says high environmental integrity. And high environmental integrity to us is important, but for us it's how do you define that? And how we have laid that out, how we have put it out is really to identify some of the key criteria of what exactly it means to be high environmental integrity. And then, because criteria operates at a very 50, 60,000 level, to then translate that to what exactly does it mean in terms of specific standards, specific methodologies. And in this case, we reference some of the key standards and meta standards out there. So we reference PACM, we reference ICAO CORSIA, we reference ICVCM as key reference points itself. But actually, I thought the more important thing in terms of this approach is that we take a criteria approach towards identifying what's good quality. We don't take a category approach. We don't go out there and say that there's this broad dichotomy that, removals are better than reductions itself. The criteria needs to be applied regardless of what sort of project type you are, and we've made that very clear. And the last piece, which actually has came up in many discussions, is what is the interaction between corporate use of credits as well as compliance use of credits itself. Do corporates, when they use credits, need corresponding adjustments? And I think there we made it very clear. Actually, the key concept is there should be no double counting and no double claiming. And so long as the corporate is using it for voluntary purposes and it's not part of any compliance regime, say, for example, a company surrendering the credits for compliance purpose under the Singapore tax mechanism, actually double counting, you don't need corresponding adjustment to address double counting. So those are three, I mean, it's not exhaustive, but those are the three big buckets which we have heard from corporates. It's important, it's key that actually we lay that out itself. Thanks.
No, that's like exhaustive, and that kind of, I want to ask like Anshari to sort of build on that, right? I mean, because you look at like globally in terms of like, your investments, and you've seen these developments coming from the ground, like, in Singapore. Where do you still see gaps for corporates, like, for them to have the confidence to go and use a carbon credit as part of the decarbonization journey?
Yeah. Let me address the question first, but I also want to weigh in on what, to respond to what Saurabh and Ben has mentioned. I think right now, the key gap, and this probably merits a bit more work, is how do you define what is residual and what is hard to abate, right? And I think it's not going to be very easy, and it requires quite a bit of collective work and collaboration actually globally to define this properly. Because once you have a bit more clarity on this, then you've got a bit more confidence that the corporate has kind of exhausted its efforts, right? And there's a bit more confidence that the residual emissions you can offset, to use a very taboo term, right? Now, when we look at SMEs and large corporations with footprints in many different countries, I think the immediate challenge for SMEs is to gather the data to measure their carbon footprint, right, and see what their exposure is. But for larger companies, it's quite straightforward. You have to look at your carbon price exposure, both from your supply chain, your exposure to CBAM, right, exposure to carbon tax. And you need to start to develop your decarbonization journey, which includes what we like to advocate, a portfolio of carbon credits, right? And a portfolio of carbon credits will tie in quite well with what Ben mentioned around a criteria-based approach, right? Right now, we are seeing in the space a lot of emphasis that we only want removals credits, and we only want durable removals credits, tech-based removal credits. Right? But a criteria-based approach, and you have international frameworks such as ICVCM and CORSIA that define across reductions, removals, technology, nature, what is good enough, right? And you can actually supplement that with project-level ratings. So it's a lot more transparent today. You've got B0, K-League, Silvera, right? That gives you some comfort that this particular project that you're buying from has an investment grade or maybe a pathway towards new methodology and whatnot. So a corporate should start to get smart about this space because it is complex, and then you start to deal with the interactions between the voluntary side and the compliance side, right? I think the effort is good in the way that the criteria-based approach would be relevant to voluntary claims and use of corporate carbon credits and compliance claims, right? And then you layer on CA, perhaps you could have an inventory of credits once you get some kind of authorization from the host country, which could be fungible in the compliance phase when you have exposure to it. Yeah.
No, thank you for sort of laying out and like kind of like coming into that quality question, which I really wanted to ask like Chris about. How do you sort of determine like, what you're sort of buying is of that high quality, high integrity? I mean, we did mention about the meta standards. I wanted to look at like, both at that like at that project level as well. How do you get that comfort? And also want to lay in like SSFA's work, like which you sort of like co-lead, where that claims guidance document that's kind of coming from SSFA will sort of like, provide some of that like, answers to corporates.
Yeah, look, so the ICVCM has been working to create this, as you say, kind of meta standard, Uber standard, whatever you like to call it. But it's basically, the idea is that it creates the framework that buyers can have ultimately to say, well, I know that if I'm buying credits that have been approved by the ICVCM, they've got a CCP label, these should be good quality credits, right? The standard setters, whether it's Vera, Gold Standard, Puro, or whoever, have been assessed And part of that assessment is to determine, can they actually manage the process properly? Can they actually manage the methodologies? Can they manage the VVBs, the verification and validation bodies? Can they manage their project developers? Because ultimately it's the project developer and how good they are will determine how good the carbon credit is. So that process is there to ensure that, you know, that the actual standard setters are operating to a similar standard and to similar processes to ensure that they are in control of the overall process. The second stage is then to assess the actual methodologies and determine whether these methodologies really are going to do what we think they're going to do or hope they're going to do, which is to avoid, reduce, and ultimately remove carbon dioxide. Right? And so if the standard setters are doing their job properly, and the methodologies are doing the right thing, then we should have a carbon credit that really does represent a ton of CO2. And also has many of these co-benefits. Actually, they're not co-benefits, they're default benefits. They're just what you should see in a carbon credit. And you know, we're seeing that more and more. So once you've got that, you know, there's an element of the ICVCM. If you build it, they will come. Now, what we need then is the demand side to actually be there to say, okay, yes, we accept that these are the high integrity credits. You know, again, if you think about this as a company looking to develop TVs or cars, they need to know what standard they're going to build to, and that's what the ICVCM is there for. And then governments, legislators effectively stipulate what are the criteria to say these are the standards that were acceptable for our market. And that's then the buyer can come in and go, great, okay, I bought that. I don't need to worry because I know I don't need to take my iPhone apart to determine all the components because I know that they're all actually meet a certain standard. And that's where I think the guidelines come in, because that creates that environment there. And I think what's really important is that Singapore is punches above its weight. We all know that. But it's really important that others come in and join that work. And that's why I think that the coalition to grow carbon markets, along with the UK, Kenya, and now we see many other countries joining that, such as France and Switzerland, Canada. You know, this is really key to be able to create that basic framework. You know, what is a carbon credit, right? Legally, what does that look like? So determining these sorts of things. How do we account for carbon? So all of this is really, really important, and I think that come together, that will allow that to happen. And again, that's what the SSFA is doing. We weren't just looking at the guidelines, although they're an important part of it. We were also looking at supply through the ACCF, and then we were, working out how we're going to actually get finance in. And of course, that's where Standard Chartered comes in. But not only there, we want to see a market develop that will be for high quality credits. That will be liquid, that will be transparent, that will create those price signals, and that will allow finance to flow.
No, that's. Thank you for that. Like, kind of laying that out, and kind of takes us to the final segment. And I mean, we spent a lot of time in initiatives that are sort of driving that confidence, right, for corporates to get started on this journey. And I want to sort of like ask you all to crystal gaze a bit. And sort of think about what are some of the other enablers that are needed, right, from a carbon market perspective. We have not touched on insurance. We know that that's something that, there's been a lot of interest. We just had a discussion on carbon insurance just before this. We've also had conversations around, Chris, with you on that legal nature, like the accounting treatment for carbon credits. And we have not touched on that disaggregated market infrastructure that currently exists for carbon as well. So for this to be the voluntary carbon market, to be that scalable, sizable sort of solution for decarbonization for Asia, what are some of the enablers that need to be in place? Anshari, do you want to go first?
So for carbon markets, I think digitalization is probably the next immediate thing, which is a low-hanging fruit, right, for the carbon market. And you will notice standard bodies like Vera, Gold Standard, and others are already starting to adopt digitalization. It gives much more expedient access to the data that you wanna access from the project document itself. But for the project developers, probably a more efficient process of getting projects registered, right? So that's, I think, a low-hanging fruit for the carbon markets. And digitalization can be applied across the value chain. So that's something that I hope will be a bit more ubiquitous in the system. For scaling of the demand and to scale more high quality projects, I think we need a little bit more convergence and harmonization on what is good enough, right? And I think the work, Chris has alluded to it, the coalition. So congratulations to Singapore, UK, Kenya, and other countries for launching this. The principles are quite clear because as someone who's been in the carbon market for some time, I feel these are quite straightforward, but it keeps persisting in the debates and discourse internationally around what credits count towards corporate use, technology, nature, removals, reductions. So all these false dichotomies, I think it's good to have governments to back what is a common set of principles. And I think for SSFA, you are also part of the ASEAN Common Carbon Framework, and we look forward to this also potentially being adopted by the other carbon market associations within the region as ACCF scales and move to the next stage. Yep, thank you.
So you've touched on like digitalization, harmonization there. Benedict.
I think building on what Anshari talked about, digitalization, I'd say actually underpinning the digitalization, or what digitalization enables, I think it's greater transparency. I think we really need to start thinking about injecting greater transparency into carbon markets, because that's what helps market work more efficiently, help drive things like the price discovery process, but also more importantly, helps to build confidence in the market itself. It's very difficult to be confident in a market if the products are all very differentiated. There's a lot of opacity in the market. So I think that's one key pillar. And I think digitalization opens up the possibility for us to do that at scale and at a much faster speed itself. The other thing that I wanted to touch on is really to share the thinking about why we decided to come together, the 3 countries as well as some of the founding members, on this coalition to grow carbon markets. So we wanted guidelines to provide confidence to companies, to provide the air cover, the safe harbor for them to boldly use credits to drive greater ambition in decarbonization. But we also wanted some form of flexibility because different countries will have different national circumstances. So this is very key. The shared principles that was released is meant to drive greater consistency, but not greater uniformity. Because it's very difficult if a corporate wants to use credits, operates in 10 different jurisdictions, and all 10 different jurisdictions have different guidelines on corporate use of carbon credits. It will be incredibly confusing. There'll be so much friction, and I think the market would find it a lot more difficult to work in an effective manner. So that's one key piece itself. The last thing that I wanted to mention is that when we develop these shared principles, it's not with the view that it just stays as principles, something nice to have on the shelf, but I think we are thinking about operationalizing some of the key concepts within the principles itself. So the coalition is not a once-off coalition that we form for COP30. We see ourselves doing work going forward, and I think we hope to work with more partners, both corporates as well as sovereigns, to effect and to implement these principles so as to scale carbon markets, especially on the corporate front. Thanks.
And what, like Ambassador mentioned at the launch, it's a working coalition. So the work is cut out for the coalition. And so building on that, like Chris, what do you see as some of the key enablers that is needed?
Well, I think I'm really keen to see those really basic, the fundamental requirements to see the market work in the first place. Things like the legal side. We talked about unit droit, the accounting side as well. And I think it's so important that we see that capacity building in the various supply side countries to ensure that they're able to develop the markets and the infrastructure there that will generate the credits in a consistent way. Don't have to be exactly the same, but they have to have certain facets that are recognizable. And that transfer of title, I think, is extremely important. And that connectivity between the registries, the independent registries, the private side registries, if you like, and their own domestic registries. Now, we've seen this in Indonesia with the mutual recognition agreements that they've signed with 5 global crediting standards now. And I think that's quite a good template. But that's one piece, but you also need the legal side as well. So you need to know what is it that a project developer needs to know up front about how they develop a project and how that transfer of title to the underlying underlying asset, the emissions reduction or removal, right? At the moment, the standard setters and their registries are just registers. They're just a list of credits. There isn't that ownership, that true ownership, and that's something I think that we need to see, and that's that connectivity to the underlying domestic markets. I mean, if you think about it, you wouldn't turn up in the country and start drilling for oil without a permit, or even farming. You need to know the land rights around your property. And then there's another permit that you will need if you want to export that particular product, and that to me is where the corresponding adjustment comes in the LOA. So these are the things, the fundamental building blocks, and we're starting to see it happening now. As I said, Indonesia is one of them, but some of the African countries are putting the legislation in place, and obviously Singapore's doing a great job there with the bilateral agreements that they're putting in place. Really kind of trying to build the capacity, but also ensure there's a consistency.
So capacity building and that legal nature, and it is also super important for that for that asset to be collateralizable and makes it important in that financing side as well. Saurabh, over to you.
Probably 2 points from me, and the first is really building on what Ben has said. I think the work of the coalition is essential, and we really need to enable an environment where corporates recognize that they need to actually go beyond reducing their own emissions, which is essential, but at the same time they do need to start investing in other projects that can deliver climate impact at scale, and to enable and create an environment in which they are confident in doing that, I think is critical. The second point, perhaps a little bit biased from where I sit at Climate Impact X, but I think robust market infrastructure and you need an exchange that can be trusted, that has transparency at its core, and allows for the trading, settlement, and custody of credits, and again, tries to build confidence amongst all market participants to be able to participate in the carbon market.
So broadly, the harmonization and that liquidity that can be brought by the exchange. I think we do have 5 minutes, so I want to see if there are any questions from the floor. Okay.
First, I'm Tong Yen from Capo. Firstly, thanks for the wonderful panel discussion and the 2 presentations before. I noticed that both Eu-Lin and Shawn spoke about what are the impediments to the demand for carbon credits. I would have thought it was quite obvious why there was limited demand. Firstly, because you are supposed to use carbon credits for unavoidable residual emissions. If you look in terms of straight line decarbonisation pathways, most companies are not at the point of dealing with residual unavoidable emissions. So you'll be doing other things and not demanding carbon credits. And the second thing, of course, is that if you look at put aside GenCos, put aside transport companies, most companies' profile would be Scope 2 emissions. And the best practice is to use renewable energy credits or on-site generation to reduce Scope 2 emissions. So again, that inherently reduces demand for carbon credits. The compliance credits, I think there will be very strong demand, that's clear. But for voluntary credits, I would have thought one of the things we need to do is to increase the demand for it. And right now, because of how it's defined, there is just limited demand. So we look forward to the guidance. Thank you.
Can I? Well, the first point is, I think this is the problem we've got. Is we talk about voluntary credits, right? And yes, absolutely. The claims, the guidelines we're talking about today are around voluntary action. Okay, but I think that when it comes to the supply of credits, we need proper rules, guidelines, clear definitions around that, because it shouldn't really be voluntary how you generate a carbon credit, right? Because that's really, we need to know that these are carbon credits and that they're high quality and that they really do what we say they do. But then what we're doing is we're generating credits that can be used for many different things. So voluntary purposes is one of them, but really it's for them to be able to move seamlessly into compliance markets. To a certain extent, you've got that with the Singapore. The tax is a compliance tax. I've never known a voluntary tax, that's for sure. And you're able to then use those credits up to a certain level. And why wouldn't you, right? If the credits are below the tax, you're going to buy the credits, right? So that will create demand. And I'd love to see all of the ETSs and all of the tax systems around the world allow for a certain proportion of international carbon credits, project-based carbon credits of high quality to be used.
I think if I could just add on one point there is around, if you're talking about residual emissions, I think if you're looking at some of the guidance or the amendments or developments on the guidance frameworks that are being released, there's a recognition that corporates do need to still account for the emissions as they progress to achieving their net zero, which means increasingly they are being encouraged to start participating in carbon markets. So you're right, today perhaps that encouragement has not been there, but hopefully we're going to see more demand come in because of that.
Yeah, I really just wanted to add that if you look at the Singapore domestic guidance as well as the shared principles from the coalition, it does not prohibit the use of credits for ongoing emissions. In fact, one of the things that we are trying to drive and push is to try to blur the lines between voluntary markets and compliance markets. I mean, markets work more effectively if the rules, there's more harmonization and consistency itself. And what's worrying is that the specific example that you cite about you can only use credits for residual emissions right at the end, actually it's not consistent with what has been agreed under the Paris Agreement. The Article 6 under the Paris Agreement, I mean from conceptualization all the way until the final rulebook last year, took 10 years to agree upon amongst 190 countries. And one of the key underpinnings of it is that you need to address under the curve emissions. This is really cumulative emissions because ultimately the warming of the atmosphere is based on cumulative emissions. It's not based on point emissions. It's not based on what somebody does at a residual year itself. So that's a key concept that is ingrained in how Article 6 in the Paris Agreement works. And I think what's worrying is that if there are alternative and other standards out there, guidelines that put up something that is completely inconsistent with this, it drives greater fragmentation of the market. And I don't think that's positive for greater market development. And it's also against some of the key things that we are working towards right now. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. Winston, you have a question?
Science-based.
No, not really. Hi, Winston Chow, concerned citizen. Thanks for a fantastic panel and a great set of presentations. You made a very difficult subject very approachable to all of us, so very, very appreciative of that. My question is about the elephant in the room. None of what you said so far deals with the absence of a particular party in these negotiations of a certain country that has played a role of a considerable spoiler in terms of announcements from their executive branch. I'm just wondering about the panel's views about how resilient do you think carbon markets will be with the considerable policy uncertainty that is directed from the United States. So interested to hear your thoughts about that.
I can start, but I hope I'm not alone. I'll say political will is renewable, right? So let's see how, I think there is a more durable narrative out there. And actually when you look at the data, just on carbon markets alone, there are corporates in one country that is actually retiring the bulk of the credits today. It's just not being evangelized, right? It's just fewer announcements. Those who have actually attended New York Climate Week can tell that the buzz is still there. There's still a lot of activity. There's still a lot of capital being deployed. The philanthropists are not shying away, right? So I think it's probably just a pause at the political level and what's visible in terms of headlines, but the work still continues. Actually, the other elephant in the room is how can carbon markets deliver other forms of benefits, including your field of expertise, adaptation finance, right? And this is where I think when we were doing Article 6, it's seen to be the silver bullet to Paris Agreement, because it has to solve mitigation, it has to go beyond offsetting, it has to deliver finance to adaptation, right? And perhaps we'll see a world in future where carbon markets can go beyond offsetting ongoing emissions, residual emissions, hard to abate, but actually deliver benefits socially, biodiversity, but also to adaptation itself. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in many ways the voluntary markets developed in the US first because of a lack of policy signals. So, and in fact, during the first presidency, the actual use of voluntary of project-based carbon credits went up. And so, you know, as Anshari says, there was real interest in New York when we were there for Climate Week. I see a lot of interest coming from US companies who want to, you know, they've got customers as well, right? And their customers and their stakeholders they're saying, we want you to do this, and we want you to take responsibility and take accountability for what's going on in the world. And so, yeah, I think that you know, I'm as bullish as you can be around the around what's going on. I think the other thing is it's around commerce as well. As long as we talk about markets and we talk about, you know, commercial opportunities, I think that there'll be support.
Final comments.
Yeah, so I think to your question, if we take a step back and look at what carbon markets is all about, carbon markets is about collaboration, it's about cooperation between two different countries or two different companies in two different geographies to unlock abatement that would not have occurred otherwise. And in this environment that we are in right now, cooperation and collaboration, I think, has become even more critical than in the past, when countries are just trying to do things within their own national boundaries itself. So that's one. The other thing is that carbon markets, carbon projects, it's really about using the carbon revenue to crowd in private financing that would not have occurred otherwise. And this aspect of crowding in and bringing in private financing, a greater pool of private financing, I'd say it's quite independent of political ideology, regardless of which side of the pew you're on. It's something that makes sense. It's something that actually we should continue driving for. So I'd say let's find a way to push forth some of these very worthy and very critical aspects of carbon markets without maybe being too obsessed about the fact that it's carbon or it's related to climate or what. And I really think there's a way forward. Yeah.
Just a final. In the arena of global contestation, political contestation, we can just go 2 pavilions down and see where there is potentially one country that is stepping up on international cooperation and carbon markets. Yeah.
I think that brings us to the end of our time. I would request you to put your hands together for our fantastic panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavitha, Eu-Lin, Shawn, and our esteemed panelists. May I invite the panelists to stay on the stage for a photo taking, please. Eu-Lin and Shawn, please join us.